In a remote region near a mountain canyon, a millionaire businessman abandons a pink children's backpack among rocks and bushes, unaware that he's being watched. What he doesn't realize is that inside the backpack lies something that will change everything. When a majestic white horse finds the abandoned object and sniffs its contents, he categorically refuses to move away, remaining as a silent guardian and neighing desperately to draw attention. When his owner finally arrives to investigate the animal's strange behavior and opens the backpack, the discovery leaves him in complete shock. Before we continue, if you love animals as much as we do, subscribe now to the channel so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thank you. Now, back to our story. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the harsh whisper of wind against red rock. On that September morning, as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, the executive Richard Sterling parked his black Mercedes on a deserted dirt track, far from any civilization. His Italian leather shoes, which cost more than most people make in a year, left precise prints in the red dust as he walked with measured steps toward the precipice. In his hands, a brutal contrast to his imposing businessman's figure, was a child's pink backpack, decorated with little unicorns and glittery stars. The colorful fabric seemed to scream against the arid landscape, as if protesting the grim purpose of his journey. Richard gripped the strap tightly, his tanned fingers a stark contrast to the delicate object he carried. The smell of dry earth mingled with the wild scent of sage, creating an atmosphere that should have been peaceful, but at that moment carried a suffocating weight. The executive stopped between boulders and thorny shrubs, carefully choosing an isolated spot where no prying eyes could reach. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he placed the backpack on the parched earth, but his expression remained cold, calculating. For a moment, he hesitated. Not out of remorse, he had buried that long ago under layers of pride and ambition, but from the certainty that he was making the only possible decision. His wife, Helena, had discovered everything 3 weeks earlier. The texts, the meetings, the pregnancy of the young maid. The ultimatum had been clear. Either he solved the problem for good, or he would lose everything he had fought for over 40 years. "I can't let her destroy my family," he muttered to himself, the words swallowed by the hot desert wind. It was a justification he repeated constantly, a mantra meant to erase the small voice in his conscience that still insisted on whispering objections. The backpack lay still on the ground, but from within came an almost imperceptible sound, a faint, muffled whimper that made Richard's heart race. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself not to think about what he had just done. The young woman, Maria, had died in childbirth just 2 days ago, taking all her secrets with her. Now, only the final problem remained to be solved. On the horizon, a hawk circled in slow, lazy loops, its wings motionless against the relentless blue sky. Richard watched the bird for a few seconds, envying its freedom, its ability to fly far away from human troubles. He himself would soon be free. Returning to his mansion in Scottsdale, where Helena awaited him with a cold smile and the promise that everything could go back to normal. Without a backward glance, Richard walked back to the car, his steps now more hurried, as if fleeing something he didn't want to face. The Mercedes's engine purred softly as he turned the ignition, a sound of luxury that contrasted grotesquely with what he had just abandoned among the rocks. The car disappeared in a cloud of red dust, leaving behind only footprints already being erased by the wind and a small pink backpack that stood out like a colorful wound in the arid landscape. The silence reigned supreme once more, but not for long. A few miles away, a majestic white horse suddenly lifted its head, its nostrils flaring as it caught something on the wind. Its dark eyes, deep as pools of ancient wisdom, turned toward the canyon. Something was wrong, terribly and urgently wrong. The instinct that had saved its life countless times in the past was now screaming silent alarms in its mind. There was danger there, but not for him, for someone small, helpless, who desperately needed help. The white horse began to trot in the direction of the wind, following a call only it could hear. The white horse moved along the dusty trail with a determination that would have surprised any observer. Its hooves struck a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, creating a solitary symphony that echoed among the rock formations. Alamo, as his owner called him, possessed a keen intuition that set him apart from the other animals in the region. He sensed things others couldn't perceive, foresaw trouble before it even manifested. That morning, the strange scent that had reached him carried notes that awakened all his protective instincts. It wasn't the familiar aroma of injured animals or plants scorched by the unforgiving sun. It was something different, more complex, blending human fragility with urgent desperation. Alamo quickened his pace, his white mane rippling in the wind as he followed the invisible trail guiding him. Miles away, in the rustic ranch house where he had lived for 5 years, Thomas Wright rose from the rocking chair, where he'd been dozing, and walked out onto the porch. His 60 years had been weighing more heavily on him lately, especially on mornings when he woke up expecting to see Clara making coffee in the kitchen. 2 years had passed since she was gone, a victim of a silent cancer that had left no time for a proper goodbye. "Alamo!" he called, cupping his hands around his mouth. Normally, the horse would appear on the horizon as soon as he heard his name, trotting cheerfully toward the fence where Thomas waited with fresh carrots and kind words. But that morning, the field remained empty, only the wind answering his call. A familiar worry began to form in his chest. Alamo never strayed so far from the property, especially not during the hottest hours of the day. The animal had become more than just a horse after Clara's death. He was his companion, confidant and sole source of joy on days that sometimes seemed endless. Thomas walked back inside the cabin, his steps heavy on the wooden floorboards Clara had helped him install years ago. Every sound in the house echoed with memories. Every corner held fragments of a shared life that now existed only in his mind. He and Clara had tried to have children for decades, but fate had decided otherwise, leaving a void that all the love in the world couldn't quite fill. Meanwhile, Alamo continued his journey, following clues that only he could interpret. The scent grew stronger as he neared the canyon, mixing with the aroma of sun-baked rocks and the small plants that stubbornly grew between them. His ears twitched constantly, catching sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The horse stopped abruptly when he spotted something that didn't belong in the arid landscape. A splash of bright pink among the grey rocks, like an impossible flower that had sprouted from the dry ground. Alamo approached cautiously, his steps now slower, more careful. Every fiber of his animal being was on alert, processing information that his equine brain translated into pure urgency. When he was finally close enough, the horse sniffed the air around the abandoned backpack. The scent was intense now, heavy with young humanity and extreme vulnerability. Alamo lowered his muzzle, his nostrils flaring as he investigated the strange object someone had left in the middle of nowhere. That's when he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from inside the bag. A weak, desperate cry that made every muscle in his body tense. The white horse took a step back, then two, but something stronger than fear drew him back. His instincts screamed that there was life here, life that needed protection. Alamo positioned himself beside the backpack and began to neigh loudly, a sound that cut through the canyon's silence like a blade. It was a primal, urgent call that echoed off the rocks and spread through the valley. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to bring someone here. Time was running out for whoever was inside that pink backpack. Alamo's neighs echoed through the canyon like a desperate cry for help. The white horse stomped his hooves on the dry ground, kicking up small clouds of dust that quickly dissipated in the hot air. His agitation grew with each passing minute. As the faint cry from inside the pink backpack seemed to be getting weaker, Thomas, on the porch of his ranch house, stopped suddenly as the distant sound reached his ears. He had known that neigh for enough years to know it wasn't an ordinary call. There was urgency in it, desperation. Alamo never behaved that way unless something was seriously wrong. "What is it, boy?" he murmured to himself, heading down the porch steps with renewed haste. His boots left prints in the dirt as he made his way to the small shed where he kept his old pickup truck. The vehicle was over 15 years old, but it still ran perfectly, adapted to the harsh conditions of the arid region. As he drove in the direction of the neighs, Thomas felt a growing anxiety in his chest. Alamo had been his faithful companion through all his years of grief, the one being who seemed to understand his silent pain. The thought that something might have happened to the animal terrified him more than he was willing to admit. The road to the canyon was rough, filled with rocks and potholes that demanded constant care. Thomas knew every curve, every obstacle, having driven this route hundreds of times on his solitary drives. The landscape around him remained unchanged: red rocks, thorny bushes, and the endless blue sky that seemed to swallow all sound. When he finally spotted Alamo in the distance, Thomas felt a momentary relief. The horse was on his feet, apparently unharmed, but his behavior was completely out of character. He stood motionless next to something colorful on the ground, like a silent guardian refusing to abandon his post. Thomas parked the truck and got out slowly, his legs not as nimble as they used to be. "Alamo, what are you doing out here?" he asked, approaching carefully. The horse looked at him for a moment, then turned his attention back to the object on the ground, neighed again, and stomped his hooves as if trying to communicate something urgent. It was then that Thomas saw it clearly. A child's pink backpack, completely out of place in this desolate environment. His first reaction was confusion. What would a kid's backpack be doing here, in the middle of nowhere? Who could have left it in such a remote place? Alamo moved to stand between Thomas and the backpack, not aggressively, but protectively. His dark eyes held an intensity the rancher had never seen before. The horse lowered his muzzle toward the bag and then looked directly at Thomas, as if pleading with him to investigate. "All right, boy, I get it," Thomas said, reaching out a hand to soothe the animal. "Let me see what this is." As he knelt beside the backpack, Thomas heard it. A sound so faint he initially thought it was just the wind in the rocks. But Alamo neighed again, softer this time, almost an urgent whisper. The rancher tilted his head, concentrating, and then he heard it clearly. A muffled, desperate cry coming from inside the backpack. His hands trembled as he reached for the zipper. In his 60 years of life, Thomas had faced many difficult situations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Alamo remained still beside him, as if understanding the gravity of what was about to be revealed. The zipper slid down slowly, and Thomas felt his heart pound. He had no idea what he would find inside, but he knew his life was about to change forever. The crying became more audible, more desperate, and Thomas realized there was no time for hesitation. "My God," he whispered, bracing himself to uncover the mystery Alamo had found in that desolate canyon. The backpack's zipper came all the way down, revealing an interior that made Thomas recoil instinctively. Inside, wrapped in dirty makeshift cloths, was a newborn baby girl. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her face red and contorted from crying, and she moved feebly as if fighting against something unseen. "This can't be real," Thomas murmured, his words swallowed by the hot desert wind. His hands shook violently as he looked at the infant, trying to process the enormity of what he had just discovered. Who could do something so monstrous? Who could abandon a helpless baby in the middle of nowhere, at the mercy of the blistering heat and predators? Alamo moved closer, lowering his muzzle toward the backpack. The horse seemed to fully understand the fragility of the situation, his movements becoming extremely careful. He gently sniffed the air around the baby, as if assessing her condition, and then looked at Thomas with an expression that seemed to say, "Do you have to do something now?" Thomas lifted the baby with extreme care, his arms trembling not just from emotion, but from the sudden responsibility that had fallen upon him. The child was far too warm, her breathing shallow and weak. Clear signs of dehydration marked her small face, and Thomas knew that every minute was crucial. "It's okay, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." The baby opened her eyes for a moment, revealing a clear blue gaze that seemed to search for something familiar amidst the chaos. Thomas felt his heart break at the sight of that look of total helplessness, that desperate search for the protection and love every child deserved to find. Alamo neighed softly, an almost maternal sound that seemed to soothe the baby. The horse stood beside Thomas, creating a protective barrier against the wind and sun. It was as if he intuitively understood that his mission now was to protect this fragile life that fate had placed in his path. "I have to get her out of here," Thomas said, more to himself than to the horse. "I need help. I need Rosa." Rosa Martinez was his closest neighbor, a retired nurse who lived alone in a small house a few miles away. She had been a friend of Clara's during his wife's final years, and Thomas knew he could trust her. If anyone could help this baby, it was Rosa. With careful movements, Thomas wrapped the infant in his own shirt, creating a makeshift shelter against the heat. The baby continued to cry weakly, but seemed to respond to human touch, her tiny fists closing around his fingers. "Alamo, I need you to come with me," Thomas said, addressing the horse. "This little one is going to need all of us." The white horse followed him to the pickup truck, his hooves creating a steady soundtrack that seemed to say, "I'm here. I won't leave you." Thomas settled the baby on the seat beside him, keeping a protective hand on her while he drove with the other. The drive to Rosa's house felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road, every jolt made Thomas worry about the fragile child he carried. Alamo followed the truck, always staying close, like a silent guardian who had taken on the duty of protecting this life. When they finally reached Rosa's house, Thomas honked the horn repeatedly, an urgent sound that cut through the afternoon silence. The door opened quickly, revealing a woman in her late 50s, her grey hair in a bun and her brown eyes immediately filling with concern. "Thomas, what happened?" Rosa asked, coming down the porch steps. "I found an abandoned baby," Thomas replied, his voice thick with urgency. "She needs medical help, right now." The world for all of them was about to change forever. Rosa Martinez didn't waste time with questions. Her years of experience as a nurse surfaced instantly when she saw the baby in Thomas's arms. With precise professional movements, she guided him into the house, her hands already assessing the infant's condition before she even touched her. "Did you put her here on the kitchen table?" Rosa instructed, quickly spreading clean towels over the surface. "I need to check her condition. How long do you think she was out there?" "I don't know for sure," Thomas answered, his hands still trembling as he carefully placed the baby on the towels. "Alamo led me to her. He's been agitated since this morning, like he knew something was wrong." Rosa leaned over the child, her experienced fingers checking pulse, temperature, and respiration. What she saw worried her deeply. The baby was severely dehydrated, with clear signs of prolonged heat exposure. Her skin was far too hot, and her shallow breathing indicated extreme stress. "She's in critical condition," Rosa murmured, moving quickly to a cabinet where she kept medical supplies from her retirement. "I need to bring her temperature down and start rehydrating her immediately." Alamo, who had been left outside, began to pace nervously around the house. The white horse seemed to sense the urgency of the situation, his hooves tapping a rhythmic beat on the ground as soft neighs escaped his throat. It was as if he was standing guard, protecting the house where the baby was receiving care. "Thomas, I need your help," Rosa said, preparing solutions and medications. "I'll need lukewarm water, not too hot." and all the clean towels you can find in the hall closet." As they worked together, a silent connection formed between the two adults. Rosa had lost her husband 3 years ago in a work accident and had lived alone ever since, lending her medical skills to neighbors when needed. Thomas, in turn, found in this situation a chance to channel all the fatherhood he had never been able to exercise. Who could do this? Thomas asked, watching Rosa work with impressive efficiency. Who abandons a baby in the middle of the desert? Someone very desperate, Rosa replied, not taking her eyes off the child. Or someone very cruel. I can't think of any other explanation. The baby began to respond to the care gradually. Her breathing stabilized, and her cry, though still weak, became more consistent. Rosa managed to get her to take small sips of a rehydration solution, and each positive reaction from the child was a small victory. "Is she going to be okay?" Thomas asked, his voice full of paternal anxiety. "It's still too early to be sure," Rosa answered honestly. "But she's responding to treatment. She's a fighter, this little one." Outside, Alamo had positioned himself strategically where he could see the kitchen window. The horse remained motionless, a white sentinel against the arid landscape, his ears constantly twitching, catching any sound that might mean danger. "You know what worries me," Rosa said, as she changed the baby's makeshift clothes for clean cloths. "Whoever did this might come back. If they find out she survived." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with dark implications. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't considered that possibility before, but now he realized they might be dealing with something far more dangerous than simple abandonment. "So what do we do?" Thomas asked. "For now, we take care of her," Rosa replied, covering the baby with a soft blanket. "And we pray that whoever did this thinks she didn't make it." The baby opened her eyes again, and this time her gaze seemed to meet Thomas's. In that moment, he knew that no matter what happened, he would not let any harm come to this child. Outside, Alamo neighed softly, as if agreeing with the silent decision that had just been made. The following days unfolded in a delicate and intense routine. Rosa had turned her guest room into a makeshift nursery, where the baby, whom they had affectionately started calling Sophia, received constant care. Thomas had practically moved in, sleeping on the living room sofa to be close by if needed. Alamo had established his own surveillance routine. During the day, the white horse would graze near the house, but always with a watchful eye on the surroundings. At night, he would position himself strategically under the window of the room where Sophia slept, a silent guardian who never let his guard down. "I've never seen an animal behave like this," Rosa remarked one morning as she made coffee and watched Alamo through the window. "It's as if he fully understands the importance of what's happening here." Thomas, who was cradling Sophia in his arms, smiled for the first time in weeks. "Alamo has always been special, but since we found the little one, he seems to have found a purpose he didn't know he was looking for." The baby had recovered remarkably in the last few days. Her color had improved, her breathing had completely stabilized, and she was beginning to show the first signs of a strong temperament. She cried when she was hungry, quieted when she was held, and her eyes now followed familiar faces with growing interest. "She has an interesting birthmark," Rosa noted, gently examining the child's right arm. "It looks like a tiny star on her wrist. It could be useful for identification in the future." Thomas moved closer to see. The mark was delicate but distinctive, a small, star-shaped blemish that stood out subtly against the baby's fair skin. "Do you think we should document it somehow?" "I already photographed it," Rosa replied, showing him some pictures she had taken with an old digital camera. "I've documented everything since she got here. Weight, measurements, general condition. If we ever need to prove we took good care of her." The sentence hung in the air, loaded with worries they both preferred not to voice. They both knew they couldn't keep Sophia indefinitely without someone asking questions. But they also knew that turning her over to the authorities could put her in danger again. "I need to go into town tomorrow," Thomas said, settling Sophia more comfortably in his arms. "Buy supplies, diapers, proper clothes, and maybe talk quietly with a few people." Rosa looked at him with concern. What kind of people? People who might have heard something. Rumors, strange talk, someone who might have seen something unusual in the area recently. Thomas paused, his eyes meeting hers. "We need to find out who did this, Rosa. We can't just hope they never show up again." Outside, Alamo suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching toward the road. The horse stood motionless for a few seconds, then relaxed, returning to his vigilant grazing. A false alarm, but a constant reminder that danger could appear at any moment. "And if we find out who it was?" Rosa asked, her voice low. "What do we do then?" Thomas looked down at Sophia, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms. The child had become more than a responsibility. She had become a source of love and purpose he thought he had lost forever. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect her," he answered, his voice firm. "She's ours now, Rosa. I won't let anyone hurt her." Rosa nodded, feeling her own emotions align with Thomas's. The baby had brought something back to their lives, a sense of family, of shared purpose. "Then we'll find the truth," she said. "But carefully." "Very carefully." Alamo neighed softly from outside, as if approving the decision that had just been made. The fight to protect Sophia was just beginning. Paranoia consumed Richard Sterling like a slow, persistent poison. 3 days had passed since he abandoned the pink backpack in the canyon, and with each passing hour, his need for confirmation grew. He had to know if his problem had been definitively solved, if the desert had played its silent role. Driving again down the dusty road, Richard felt his hands sweat against the Mercedes' steering wheel. He had told Helena he would handle everything, that she would never have to worry about painful reminders of his infidelity. But what if someone had found the backpack? What if his perfect solution had become an even bigger problem? "Impossible," he muttered to himself, accelerating toward the canyon. "No one goes to that place. It's too isolated, too wild." But when he arrived at the spot where he had left the backpack, Richard felt the world spin. The place was empty, completely empty. No sign of the pink backpack, no evidence that anything had been there. Only hoof prints in the dust and human footprints that were clearly not his own. "No, no, no," he repeated, getting out of the car and running to the exact spot where he had placed the backpack. He searched desperately among the rocks, thinking perhaps the wind had moved it, but there was nothing. Someone had found his final solution. Richard's mind raced, calculating possibilities and consequences. If someone had found the baby alive, if someone made the connection between the child and him, everything he had fought for decades would be lost. His reputation, his fortune, his marriage, his standing in society, it all depended on keeping that secret buried. "I have to find out who it was," he said aloud, his voice echoing among the rocks. "I have to know what happened." Richard returned to the car with a grim determination. If he couldn't solve the problem silently, he would have to use other methods. He had resources, he had influence, he had connections that could help him find out who had interfered with his plans. That same afternoon, 2 private investigators received a call from a very wealthy client offering a substantial sum for information about an alleged baby kidnapping in the Canyon region. Richard had concocted an elaborate story about his daughter being kidnapped by criminals demanding a silent ransom. "I want you to check every house within a 50-mile radius," Richard instructed over the phone. "Someone found my daughter, and I need to know who it was. Use all necessary resources." Meanwhile, at Rosa's house, Alamo suddenly raised his head, his nostrils flaring. The white horse sensed something on the air, a familiar, dangerous scent that reminded him of that first day in the canyon. His instincts screamed danger, but this time the danger wasn't close. It was approaching. Thomas, playing with Sophia in the yard, noticed the horse's altered behavior. "What is it, Alamo?" he asked. "Standing up with the baby in his arms. You sense something?" The horse positioned himself protectively between Thomas and the road, his muscles tense, ready to act. Rosa came out of the house, drying her hands on a dish towel, and immediately sensed the tension in the air. "Something's wrong," she said, approaching Thomas. "Alamo is agitated, and he only gets like this when there's real danger." "Maybe we should go inside," Thomas suggested. But before they could move, they heard the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road. It wasn't a common sound in this isolated area, especially not from a clearly expensive vehicle. A black Mercedes appeared around the bend, driving slowly, as if the driver were looking for something specific. The car stopped in front of Rosa's property, and a well-dressed man with dark sunglasses and a serious expression got out. Richard Sterling had decided to do some personal investigation. He would start with the properties closest to the canyon, asking discreet questions, observing reactions. He didn't know he was about to come face to face with the baby he had tried to eliminate. "Good afternoon," Richard said, approaching the fence. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for information about my missing daughter." Thomas instinctively held Sophia tighter against his chest, while Alamo positioned himself even more defensively. The white horse had recognized the scent. This was the man who had abandoned the baby in the canyon. The confrontation that would change everything was about to begin. The silence that followed was charged with electric tension. Richard studied the faces before him, searching for any sign of nervousness or guilt. Thomas held Sophia almost imperceptibly closer to his chest, while Rosa maintained a carefully neutral expression. Her years as a nurse helping her control her emotions. Alamo, however, couldn't hide his agitation. The white horse shifted restlessly, his hooves tapping an anxious rhythm on the ground. His nostrils flared constantly, and he held his head high, as if ready to charge at any moment. "What kind of information are you looking for?" Rosa asked, her voice controlled but wary. "How many days has your daughter been missing?" Richard adjusted his sunglasses, studying the group. 3 days, he replied, his voice laced with a concern that sounded genuine to anyone who didn't know the truth. "We believe she was kidnapped by criminals demanding a silent ransom. We're following every possible lead." "Kidnapped," Thomas repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "How old is your daughter?" "A newborn," Richard answered, watching their reactions to every word. "Just a few days old. The criminals took her from the maternity ward during a transfer." Sophia chose that moment to stir in Thomas's arms, making a small sound that caused Richard to take an instinctive step forward. The movement was subtle, but Alamo caught it immediately. The horse moved even more defensively, creating a physical barrier between Richard and the baby. "Nervous horse," Richard commented, trying to sound casual. "Does he always like this with strangers?" "Alamo is very protective," Thomas replied, his hand automatically stroking the animal's neck. "Especially when there are children around. He has a very strong instinct." Richard's heart raced. There was a baby here, the exact age she would be if she had survived. The coincidences were too much to ignore. "May I ask about the child you're caring for?" he said, trying to sound merely curious. "She's ours," Rosa answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I mean, we're looking after her temporarily. Family matters." Richard took another step forward, and this time Alamo neighed loudly, a warning sound that cut through the air like a blade. The white horse planted himself directly in the businessman's path, his dark eyes fixed on the man he recognized as a source of danger. "Interesting," Richard murmured, watching the animal's reaction. He seems to recognize me from somewhere." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way the man spoke, something in the way he looked at Sophia, that set off all his internal alarms. Alamo obviously felt the same, and the horse was never wrong about dangerous people. "Well, if you haven't seen anything suspicious in the last few days, I won't bother you any longer," Richard said, backing away slowly. But I'll leave my card in case you remember anything." He held out a sleek card that identified Richard Sterling, Sterling Holdings and Development. The name meant power and influence in the region, and everyone there knew it. "Of course," Rosa said, taking the card with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "We hope you find your daughter soon." Richard nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Sophia for a few seconds too long. "Beautiful baby," he commented. "How old is she?" "A few weeks," Thomas replied, trying to sound natural. Richard murmured, turning slowly back to his car. "Well, thank you for your time." When the Mercedes finally disappeared around the bend, Thomas and Rosa stood motionless for several minutes, as if they feared any movement might bring the man back. Alamo continued to stare down the road, still alert, still protecting. "That was him," Thomas said finally, his voice low and tense. "The man who abandoned Sophia." "I'm sure of it," Rosa agreed, looking at the card in her hand. Alamo recognized him, and the way he looked at her. Sophia began to cry, as if sensing the tension around her. Thomas rocked her gently, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty road. "He'll be back," Rosa said, "and next time, he won't come alone." The next few hours were spent in silent, tense preparation. Thomas and Rosa knew they had little time before Richard returned with reinforcements. Night fell over the arid region like a protective cloak, but neither of them could sleep properly. Sophia, as if sensing the tension around her, was more restless than usual. Alamo established a constant patrol around the property. The white horse moved in wide circles, his ears always alert, catching any sound that might indicate an approaching vehicle. His instincts were on high alert, and he knew the fight to protect Sophia was just beginning. "We need to think logically," Rosa said, rocking the baby while Thomas checked the locks on the doors and windows. "He has resources we don't. Money, influence, connections. If he decides to use all that against us, we're not going to make it easy for him," Thomas interrupted, his determination growing by the minute. "Sophia isn't just a child we found. She's our responsibility now. Our daughter." The word daughter echoed between them with profound meaning. Both had lost the chance to be biological parents, but fate had given them an unexpected opportunity. They would not allow anyone, regardless of their power or wealth, to destroy this second chance. The next morning, as predicted, Richard returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Two men in suits accompanied a local police officer, and Richard carried a folder full of documents that supposedly proved his paternal rights. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Rosa greeted the officer she had known for years. "What a surprise to see you here." "Ms. Rosa," the sergeant replied, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Mr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint about his missing daughter. I need to investigate all possibilities." Richard stepped forward, his confidence renewed by the presence of authority. "As I explained to the sergeant, I have reason to believe my daughter may be being held here. I'm not accusing anyone of bad faith, but I need to verify." Thomas appeared at the door, Sophia in his arms, and Richard's reaction was immediate. His eyes fixed on the baby with an intensity he couldn't completely hide. "That's her," he said, taking a step forward. "That's my daughter." Alamo, who had positioned himself strategically near the house, immediately moved between Richard and the entrance. The white horse refused to budge, creating a physical barrier that none of the men present dared to challenge. "Interesting," muttered one of the private investigators. "The animal seems to have a very specific reaction to Mr. Sterling." "Horses can be unpredictable," Richard replied quickly, but his voice carried a note of nervousness. "Sergeant, I need the child to be handed over immediately. I have documents proving my paternity." Sergeant Rodriguez studied the papers Richard handed him. They were convincing, drawn up by expensive lawyers, but something about the situation bothered him. "Mr. Sterling, these documents show you filed a kidnapping complaint, but I don't see a birth certificate or other documents proving paternity. They were destroyed during the kidnapping, Richard answered promptly. But I can get duplicates. Rosa stepped forward, in carrying a folder of her own. Sergeant, we'd like to show you something. She opened the folder, revealing the photograph she had taken of Sophia in the first few days, documenting her condition when she was found. This child was found abandoned, dehydrated, and in critical condition, Rosa explained, her voice professional and controlled. Whoever left her in the canyon had no intention of her surviving. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. That's impossible, he said, his voice rising a notch. My daughter was kidnapped from the maternity ward. She wasn't abandoned. Then how do you explain your horse having such a specific reaction to you? Thomas asked, pointing at Alamo. Animals don't lie, Mr. Sterling. They recognize who poses a threat. Sergeant Rodriguez looked from Richard to Alamo, then to Sophia in Thomas's arms. The baby was calm, content, obviously well cared for. But when Richard tried to approach again, she began to cry, a wail of discomfort that contrasted with her peaceful demeanor with Thomas and Rosa. This is very strange, the sergeant commented. Babies usually react well to their parents. She's traumatized by the kidnapping, Richard insisted, but his explanation sounded increasingly hollow. One of the private investigators approached the sergeant. There's something you should know, he said in a low voice. We found some inconsistencies in Mr. Sterling's story. The confrontation was escalating, and everyone knew the next move would determine Sophia's future. The private investigator, a thin, middle-aged man named Detective Santos, opened his own dossier with a serious expression. Sergeant Rodriguez, during our investigation into the alleged kidnapping, we found some disturbing information. Richard's blood ran cold. He had hired these men to find Sophia, but he hadn't expected them to investigate him as well. What are you talking about? He demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. First, there's no record of any kidnapping from a maternity ward in recent days, Santos continued. Second, we found security camera footage from a gas station showing your Mercedes on the road to the canyon on the day you claim the kidnapping occurred. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard opened and closed his mouth several times, searching for a plausible explanation. I was looking for her, he finally managed to say, following leads from the kidnappers. Alone? Sergeant Rodriguez asked, his suspicion growing visibly. Without informing the police that you had received information about the child's whereabouts. Alamo, as if sensing the truth was finally emerging, moved closer to the group. The white horse positioned himself near the sergeant, as if offering silent support to the investigation. His eyes remained fixed on Richard, his demeanor communicating something everyone present could understand. There's more, Santos said, turning a page in his report. We spoke with staff at the hospital where you claimed your daughter was born. There is no record of any child born to a woman with the name you provided. Thomas and Rosa exchanged a meaningful look. Richard's lies were being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Sophia, still in Thomas's arms, had stopped crying and seemed to be listening intently to the voices around her. Mr. Sterling, Sergeant Rodriguez said, his voice taking on a more official tone. I need you to explain these inconsistencies. Richard felt the walls closing in. His wife, Helena, had made it clear that if the scandal came out, she would leave him and take half his fortune. His social circle, built over decades, would completely reject him. He couldn't let that happen. All right, he said finally, his voice trembling. I'll tell you the truth. Everyone leaned forward, expectant. Alamo drew even closer, as if he knew the crucial moment had arrived. The child's mother was my maid, Richard began, each word coming with difficulty. She died in childbirth a week ago. I panicked. My wife couldn't know. My reputation couldn't be destroyed. So you decided to get rid of the baby, Thomas said, his voice laced with disgust. I didn't know what to do, Richard exploded. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Everything I worked for 40 years was at risk. "So you abandoned a newborn in the desert," Rosa said, her voice as cold as ice. "You left a helpless child to die." "I didn't think she would survive," Richard admitted, the words spilling out like a desperate confession. "I thought it would be quick, that no one would find out." Sergeant Rodriguez stood up, his expression clearly showing his revulsion. "Mr. Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for attempted murder and child endangerment." "No!" Richard shouted. "You can't do this. I have rights. I have lawyers." "You did," Santos corrected him. "But I suspect that when this story becomes public, a lot of things in your life are going to change." Alamo approached Sophia in Thomas's arms and gently nuzzled the baby's face. It was as if the horse was saying, "You're safe now. The danger has passed." Sophia smiled for the first time since she was found, a small but radiant smile that lit up the faces of everyone present, except for Richard, who was being handcuffed and led to the police car. "You don't know what you've done," he yelled as he was led away. "You've destroyed a family." "We saved one," Thomas replied, gently kissing Sophia's forehead. "We saved a life you tried to destroy." As the police car drove away, Alamo neighed softly, a sound that echoed through the valley like a hymn of victory. The truth had triumphed, and justice had prevailed. The following days brought a profound transformation for everyone involved. The story of Sophia's heroic rescue by the White Horse spread through the region like wildfire. Journalists from nearby cities arrived to document the extraordinary case, and Alamo became a local celebrity of sorts, often photographed near the baby he had saved. Thomas and Rosa found themselves at the center of attention they neither sought nor desired, but it served an important purpose, publicly establishing their bond with Sophia and their ability to care for her. The local community, moved by their dedication and the miraculous rescue story, offered unconditional support. "I've never seen anything like it," commented Dr. Fernandez, a pediatrician who came from the city to examine Sophia. "This child is perfect, healthy, well-nourished, obviously loved. You've done an extraordinary job." Sophia had grown visibly in the past few weeks. Her blue eyes now followed familiar faces with interest, and she responded to Thomas and Rosa's care with heart-melting smiles. Even more impressive was her connection with Alamo. Whenever the horse approached, the baby would instantly calm down, as if she recognized her savior. "It's a special bond," Rosa observed, watching Alamo carefully lean over the makeshift crib where Sophia rested in the yard. "He protects her as if she were his own." Thomas nodded, his eyes welling with grateful tears. "If it weren't for him, we never would have found her. We never would have had this chance to be a family." The legal situation was gradually being resolved. Richard's lawyers had tried to argue for his paternal rights, but the gravity of his actions, attempting to murder his own daughter, had shocked even the most cynical courts. Social workers came to evaluate the situation and were impressed by the loving environment Thomas and Rosa had created. "We will be recommending that custody remains with you," said the social worker. "A kind woman named Carmen. It's obvious that Sophia is thriving under your care, and the story of how she was found, well, some would say it was fate." Alamo, as if understanding he could finally relax his constant vigil, began to allow visitors to approach Sophia, but he always remained nearby, a silent guardian who never forgot his responsibility. One afternoon, while Thomas was working in the garden and Rosa was preparing a bottle for Sophia, Alamo did something that completely surprised them. The White Horse walked over to the original pink backpack, which they had kept as evidence, and gently touched it with his muzzle. Then he walked over to the crib where Sophia slept and made the same gesture. "He's making a connection," Rosa whispered, watching the animal's behavior. "He remembers exactly how he found her." Thomas went to Alamo and stroked his neck. "Thank you, my friend," he said softly. "Thank you for giving us this family." The horse neighed gently, a sound that had become familiar and comforting. It was as if he was saying, "It was my pleasure. This is what I was meant to do." Meanwhile, In the county jail, Richard faced the consequences of his actions. Helena had filed for divorce immediately after the revelations, taking half his fortune as she had promised. His businesses were collapsing, and his social standing was destroyed. Alone in his cell, he finally began to understand the magnitude of what he had almost done. "I tried to kill my own daughter," he muttered to himself one night, the reality finally penetrating his consciousness. "I tried to kill an innocent child for pride and fear." For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling experienced something he had never felt before: genuine remorse. Not for the inconvenience his actions had caused him, but for the horror of what he had tried to do to a helpless child. At the ranch house near the canyon, Sophia fell asleep in Thomas's arms while Rosa sang a lullaby and Alamo watched through the window. The unlikely family had found their happiness, and love had triumphed over cruelty. 3 months after the rescue, when life seemed to have found its perfect rhythm, unexpected news arrived that shook the entire family. The social worker, Carmen, appeared at Rosa's door on a cold morning, her grave expression a stark contrast to her previous, always smiling visits. "I need to talk to you," Carmen said, her voice heavy with a seriousness that made Thomas's heart race. "There's a complication in Sophia's case." Rosa invited Carmen inside, Sophia sleeping peacefully in her arms. Alamo, who had been grazing near the house, approached the window as if sensing something important was happening. "And what kind of complication?" Thomas asked, bracing for the worst. Carmen took a deep breath before answering. "Sophia's mother's family has come forward. The maternal grandmother has filed for custody, claiming she has more right to the child than you do." The silence that followed was devastating. Thomas and Rosa exchanged panicked glances. For months, they had allowed themselves to believe that Sophia was truly their daughter, that they could raise and love her without fear of someone taking her away. "But we saved her," Rosa said, her voice trembling. "We cared for her when she was dying. We love her." "I know," Carmen replied, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "But legally, biological family has precedence. The grandmother is a respectable woman. She has adequate financial resources, and the court is seriously considering her petition." Thomas stood up abruptly, walking to the window where he could see Alamo. The white horse seemed to feel the tension in the house, his ears twitching nervously as he watched the humans inside. "When?" Thomas asked, his voice barely controlled. "The hearing is next week," Carmen answered. "You'll have a chance to present your case, but I have to be honest. The odds aren't good." Sophia woke up in Rosa's arms, her blue eyes shining with the innocence of someone who doesn't understand that her happiness is under threat. She smiled at Rosa, that radiant smile that had become the greatest joy of their lives. "She doesn't know us," Rosa said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Sophia doesn't know this woman. We're her family. We're all she's ever known." "And what about Alamo?" Thomas asked, turning to Carmen. "Alamo is the one who saved her. He has a special bond with her. How can a court just ignore that?" Carmen shook her head sadly. "Courts deal with laws, not emotional bonds or stories about heroic animals. As touching as the story is, they're going to focus on financial stability, biological family, the practical aspects." Outside, Alamo began to pace in circles, his behavior reflecting the anxiety he sensed coming from the house. The white horse had protected Sophia from abandonment and death, but he couldn't protect her from the legal system. "There's something else you should know," Carmen continued. "The grandmother lives in Scottsdale. If she gets custody, Sophia will be taken far away from here. You'll likely never see her again." That was the final straw. Rosa began to cry openly, holding Sophia against her chest as if she could shield her through the sheer force of her love. Thomas moved back to them, wrapping them both in his arms. "We're not giving up," Thomas said, his voice firm despite the pain. "We're not going to let them take our daughter." "She's not technically your daughter," Carmen said gently. That's the legal reality. She's our daughter in every way that matters, Rosa retorted, her voice fierce despite the tears. Love isn't about DNA, it's about showing up, protecting, being there. And we've been here from the very first moment. Sophia, as if sensing the tension around her, began to cry. But when Alamo neighed softly from outside, she immediately quieted. The bond between them remained strong, unbreakable. We'll fight, Thomas said, his determination growing. We'll fight with everything we have. Carmen nodded, though her expression remained grim. You're going to need a miracle, she said. The court will make its decision next week, and then... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Everyone knew the family they had built through love and fate was about to be torn apart by cold, impersonal law. The day of the hearing arrived wrapped in an atmosphere of tension that stretched far beyond the courthouse. Thomas and Rosa had spent the week preparing every argument, every piece of evidence that they were the best caregivers for Sophia. Alamo, as if understanding the importance of the day, had remained constantly near the house, a comforting presence amidst the emotional storm. The courtroom was filled with people from the community who had come to support Thomas and Rosa. Local journalists were also present, turning what should have been a private legal proceeding into a public event. At the center of it all, Sophia slept peacefully in Rosa's arms, oblivious to the fact that her future was being decided. The maternal grandmother, Esperanza, was an elegant woman in her 60s, well-dressed and flanked by expensive lawyers. She watched Sophia with an expression that mixed genuine love with relentless determination. Your Honor, Esperanza's lawyer began, my client is the child's legitimate grandmother. She has adequate financial resources, a stable home in Scottsdale, and the legal right to raise her granddaughter. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying hair, carefully observed everyone present. Mr. Evans, he said, addressing Thomas and Rosa's lawyer, present your arguments. Their lawyer, a young man who had taken the case pro bono after being moved by the story, stood up nervously. Your Honor, my clients not only saved this child's life, but they have created an environment of love and care that has allowed her to thrive. But that doesn't change the fact that they are not biological family, the judge interrupted. It was then that something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened, and Richard Sterling entered, handcuffed and escorted by 2 guards. His appearance had changed drastically during his months in jail. He was thinner, with eyes that reflected a profound transformation. Your Honor, Richard said, his voice weak but determined, I ask for permission to speak. A murmur went through the room. Esperanza's lawyer immediately stood up. Objection! This man tried to murder the child. That's exactly why I need to speak, Richard replied, looking directly at the judge. I need to tell the truth about what really happened. The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. Proceed, but be brief. Richard took a deep breath, then looked at Sophia in Rosa's arms. I tried to kill my own daughter, he said, his voice thick with remorse. I abandoned her in the desert to die because I was more concerned with my reputation than with her life. Tears streamed down the face of the man who had once been only cruel and calculating. These 2, he said, pointing to Thomas and Rosa, saved the life I tried to destroy. They loved her when I rejected her. They created a family when I tried to eliminate her. What's your point, Mr. Sterling? The judge asked. My point is that family isn't about blood, Richard replied. It's about love, protection, sacrifice. I share DNA with this child, but I was never her father. They, he pointed again to Thomas and Rosa, are her true parents. Esperanza stood up, clearly moved. May I speak, Your Honor? The judge nodded, and she walked slowly to where Rosa held Sophia. May I see her? She asked softly. Rosa hesitated, then held Sophia out to the grandmother. Esperanza took the baby carefully, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at her granddaughter's face. "She's beautiful," she murmured. "She has my Maria's eyes." Sofia looked at the strange woman for a moment, then began to cry. Esperanza tried to soothe her, but the crying only intensified. It was then that a familiar sound came through the open window, Alamo's soft neigh. Immediately, Sofia stopped crying and looked toward the window. Esperanza watched the child's reaction with surprise, then looked at Thomas and Rosa. "You love her," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "With all our souls," Rosa answered, tears streaming down her face. Esperanza gently kissed Sofia's forehead, then handed her back to Rosa. "Then she should stay where she is loved," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Esperanza?" her lawyer asked, confused. "I withdraw the custody petition," she said firmly. "I want Sofia to remain with Thomas and Rosa." The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge banged his gavel, but he was smiling. "Case closed," he declared. "Custody remains with Thomas Wright and Rosa Martinez." Outside, Alamo neighed loudly, as if he knew his family was finally safe and united forever. 6 months after the hearing that changed their lives forever, life in the canyon had found a rhythm of happiness that none of the 3 adults had imagined possible. The fall painted the landscape in shades of gold and orange, creating a perfect backdrop for the family that fate had so improbably brought together. Sofia, now almost a year old, had grown into a vibrant, smiling child. Her first steps were taken in the house's yard, with Thomas and Rosa cheering emotionally, while Alamo watched proudly a few feet away. Her first words had been "Daddy" and "Mama," directed at the 2 who had loved her from the first moment. But Sofia's third word had been "horse," spoken with joy when she saw Alamo approaching for his daily ritual of affection. The bond between the child and the white horse had become legendary in the region, a living demonstration that love transcends species and that true protection comes from the heart. Thomas and Rosa had married in a simple but moving ceremony, held in their own yard, with Sofia in Rosa's arms and Alamo decorated with colorful ribbons. The entire community attended, celebrating not just the union of 2 lonely hearts, but the triumph of love over adversity. "I never thought I'd find a family at 60, Thomas often said, watching Sofia play in the yard while Alamo grazed patiently nearby. "But sometimes fate has better plans than we do." Rosa, who had discovered in late motherhood a source of joy she never knew existed, completely agreed. "Clara used to tell me that everything happens for a reason," she would often comment. Now I understand what she meant. The pink backpack that once symbolized abandonment and cruelty had been transformed into a symbol of hope. Rosa had turned it into a sort of bed for Sofia's dolls, a symbolic transformation that represented how love could change the meaning of anything. Esperanza visited regularly, bringing gifts for Sofia and stories about her mother, Maria. She had become a loving and present grandmother, fully respecting the decision she had made in court. "Family isn't about possession," she would say. "It's about unconditional love." Richard, still serving his sentence, had requested only one thing: a photograph of Sofia smiling, not to keep for himself, but to remind him daily of the life he had almost destroyed and the second chance everyone deserves. His transformation in prison had been genuine, and he dedicated his time to helping other inmates who had committed crimes against children find redemption. Alamo had become more than a pet horse. He was a family member, an eternal guardian who never forgot his original mission. Every morning, he would check that Sofia was well, gently touching her face with his muzzle before starting his daily activities. "He knows she's special," Thomas would observe, stroking the horse's neck as they watched Sofia take her first wobbly steps toward the animal. He always knew. The story of the improvised family had spread far beyond the region, inspiring others to open their hearts to children in need. Several orphanages had reported an increase in adoptions, And Alamo's story had become a symbol that the protection of the innocent comes in the most unexpected forms. One afternoon, as the sun set over the canyon, painting the sky in impossible colors, Sophia played in the yard with her dolls. Alamo lay nearby, attentive but relaxed, while Thomas and Rosa watched from the porch. "You know what impresses me most," Rosa said, holding Thomas's hand, "how everything fell into place perfectly, as if the universe conspired for us to find each other." Thomas gently kissed his wife's forehead. "It wasn't the universe," he replied, looking at Alamo. "It was love. Love always finds a way." Sophia looked up at them and smiled, that radiant smile that had become the light of their lives. Alamo neighed softly, as if approving of the perfect moment they had created together. The child who had been abandoned to die in the desert had found not just life, but a family that would love her eternally. The horse that had only followed his instincts had become a hero, and two lonely hearts had discovered that it's never too late for true love. On the horizon, the same sun that had once witnessed a cruel abandonment now illuminated a happy family, proving that even in the most arid places, love can blossom and create the most beautiful miracles.